It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. In 1989, HBO was already one of the most popular cable channels out there. I mean, it became almost synonymous with watching movies on cable. You wanted to order a pizza and stay in and watch a movie instead of going out to the theater? Well, you'd probably ask what was on HBO tonight. However, it was almost right from the start something more than just the station to watch movies that, you didn't bother to go out and see when they were in the theater or missed over the months since at the video stores, especially in the 80s. It was also more than just what you might flip on when you got back to your hotel room while on vacation. As early as 1973, about a year after it came on the air, HBO started making original content. By the mid to late 80s, HBO was cranking out a lot of television, from comedies to kids programming to dramas. They also started a couple of horror anthology series like The Hitchhiker and the Ray Bradbury Theater. Though both of them would eventually end their runs on other networks, USA Network to be exact. It's hard to say horror wasn't popular in the 80s, right? I mean, slasher movies, horror was the easiest genre to make money off of, and it was one of the biggest genres of that decade, especially because of the video store boom. But in 1989, one of their most popular series for adults and, well, kids too, began its 7-season run, Tales from the Crypt. What we're looking at today was one of the 2 spin-off feature films for the series, 1995's Demon Knight. Now, Tales from the Crypt originally was one of the EC Comics anthology series that came under fire in the mid-50s for being too gruesome for kids, their primary customer and audience. EC was started and it was published at this time and was being run by William Gaines, although his father really started the company. Gaines was a fierce publisher and a massive proponent of the First Amendment. And in the 50s, he published several anthology books at EC, including Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror, Weird Science, Weird Fantasy, Crime Suspense Stories, Two-Fisted Tales, and more. Once Friedrich Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent sent adults into a tizzy over what their kids were reading, Gaines's comic became a point of contention. He was brought up to speak to Congress about taste and how his comics' grisly covers and contents might be unappealing, mostly to adults. It's a whole thing about adults speaking for other adults and how they should raise their kids and a bunch of other censorship crap that is really kind of infuriating and something I could talk about for hours. But just know that Gaines stood his ground, which rankled the eventual heads of the comic industry self-censorship organization, the Comics Code Authority. So get this, the CCA took major offense to a reprint of a pre-code story from a February 1956 incredible science fiction issue from EC about a human astronaut being revealed as being a black man. The code said it couldn't be a black guy as the lead. I mean, that's absolutely crazy to think about. While that issue of incredible science fiction ran without the Comics Code Authority's approval and therefore ran independently, it did end up being the final comic book of EC's publishing history. Gaines wouldn't go away quietly, though, because in the ashes of EC's comics line rose the most popular and most long-lasting EC property ever, Mad Magazine, which is still a parody institution to this day, and something that's synonymous with the idea of parody magazines. Now, Tales from the Crypt would get an adaptation in 1972 as a film made by a British production company, Amicus, as was the 1973 follow-up, The Vault of Horror. Both anthology films adapted stories from various EC series, and that would be the same, for the most part, for the HBO TV show. Most, but not all, of the episodes were adaptations of EC stories across their various published titles. Well, except for Mad, I guess. But the series was a big hit, probably due to the success of the Creepshow films and the earlier anthology series Tales from the Dark Side, kind of coming ahead of it. But one of the advantages that Tales from the Crypt had over almost any other horror series on TV at the time was that its HBO home network stood outside the typical rules and standards and practices of regular networks. That's because of the premium nature of the network. So it could go as hard or as gory or as sexy as it wanted, and it only had to stick up to its own standards and practices. So some of the names connected to the series were executive producers Richard Donner, Walter Hill, Joel Silver, and Robert Zemeckis. At the time in which the series was getting off the ground, Donner and Zemeckis were huge directors. Donner was already big after The Omen in the mid-70s and certainly after 1978 Superman, but he was now making the hugely popular Lethal Weapon films by this time. Zemeckis hit it big with Back to the Future right in the middle of the 80s. And Silver was one of the biggest producers of the 80s. He not only produced the Lethal Weapon series, but also the Predator films and Die Hard. And Hill was a producer of the Alien films, as well as directed 48 Hours, which itself was produced by Silver. But all these guys cut their teeth on these anthology types of magazines and comics and wanted to kind of replicate that feel on TV. The series began to run its course by the mid-90s. It wasn't necessarily losing out in quality, but it had been going on for several years. In 1993, a Saturday morning cartoon called Tales from the Crypt Keeper aired on ABC and ran for 26 episodes before getting a 13-episode revival at the end of the 90s at CBS. By 1994, it was decided that it was time to make a movie that was presented by Tales from the Crypt. And the plan for this was actually not based on any EC comics, but on a first draft written in 1987. And word is that it was originally going to be made by Tom Holland as a follow-up to his 1988 hit Child's Play. But the script ended up getting punted around here and there and eventually ended up with Joel Silver's Silver Pictures. And it was to be the middle chapter of a Tales from the Crypt trilogy. Neither of the other two chapters were ultimately produced. But once you kind of get into the 90s, Demon Knight was supposed to be released for Halloween 1994, but it ran into a few other problems. For example, there were two scripts, one with demons and one without. It took Universal having to come in to chip in a few extra bucks as part of the distribution deal to get some more demon effects into the movie. And originally, I guess if they didn't get any extra money, it would have been a lot of demons that looked more like killer yuppies running around, because the idea was that one of these were going to end up being possessed people from this town. And that understandably made some of the producers and some of the people involved with the production a little nervous. Now, as a side note, this was directed by Ernest Dickerson. Now, Dickerson was a veteran of several Tales from the Dark Side episodes and Law and Order episodes as a cinematographer. In fact, he was Spike Lee's original director of photography, going all the way back to Lee's student film, Joe's Bed-Stuy Barbershop, We Cut Heads. And not only did he shoot Lee's first handful of films up to Malcolm X before graduating to the director's chair, he also shot Death by Temptation, another film that could definitely be a nominee to appear on Monster Mondays. Now, as for the movie itself, it probably was something of a comfort to the biggest fans of the show when they sat down to watch Tales from the Crypt presents Demon Knight at the movie theater, and it had the exact same opening as the TV show. The camera takes us through the gates of the scary house, where we then go through the inside of that manor, and we go into the basement where the Crypt Keeper pops out of his coffin and laughs at us. The movie also opens almost like the end of an episode. A sexy blonde is on the phone with a boyfriend talking about killing her husband, only for that husband to return. That husband is played by John Larroquette in an uncredited role, by the way. But he's not up to the director's standards, and that director is the Crypt Keeper himself, and he thinks Larroquette is a pretty bad actor. But he then introduces us to the movie that we are going to watch, Demon Knight. And it definitely has the Tales from the Crypt feel to that opening. Once the movie proper starts, we meet Frank Breaker, played by William Sadler, and he's driving on a lonely stretch of highway late at night. And he's being chased by Billy Zane's The Collector in another car. And despite trying to shoot the Collector's car with a shotgun, the Collector runs into Breaker's car, causing it to explode. Breaker's got a peculiar tattoo on the palm of his hand that has these glowing dots that turn into tattoos of small stars that are starting to make a formation on the palm of his hand. And he's found by a local drunk played by good old Dick Miller. And he takes Breaker to a church turned halfway house. And when they approach, the star tattoos turn into a fully completed circles in the palm of his hand, indicating that Breaker is exactly where he's supposed to be. Now, meanwhile, some cops investigate the wreckage of the two cars when they meet the Collector, and the Collector is then brought to town by the cops, and he told them that he was chasing the owner of the other car they found on the highway because he's a thief. And they are kind of keen to believe him because they get a call saying someone in town reported someone trying to steal their car. And at that halfway house, boarding house place, Breaker is a little jumpy. Any sound or indication that someone's coming in to the place kind of puts him on edge. Now, the halfway house is run by Irene, an older black lady who is willing to give a place for people to stay when they have no place else to go. You have Jerry Lean, played by Jada Pinkett, who is basically the only other employee. She fixes stuff, she cooks food, she does laundry, etc. There's Cordelia, who is a hooker who has two guys vying for her attention. Wally, played by Charles Fleischer, who was the voice of Roger Rabbit, who's kind of a down on his luck postal mailman type of guy. And Roach, played by Thomas Hayden Church, who is just flat out a jerk who comes in whenever he wants to have some fun with Cordelia. He's actually a cook at a local diner. The last people who are there before things start to take off are Breaker and then Dick Miller's Uncle Willie. When Roach explains that someone tried to steal his boss's car, Irene gets a little suspicious and decides to call the police. She doesn't really want any trouble for this place if Breaker is indeed trouble. And this brings Sheriff Tupper, Deputy Bob, and the Collector to the boarding house. Now there, Willie nearly gives the Collector what he's looking for, a key that has like these several stars of David on it, and what appears to have some sort of red liquid or blood inside of it. And the sheriff says that he just got word that actually both of those cars on the highway were stolen. So he's going to take the Collector and everybody downtown, they're going to sort it all out. But the Collector punches the sheriff in the face. And when I say he punches him in the face, I mean through his face to try to get to Breaker and the key. But Breaker is able to basically fight the Collector off of him. And the Collector goes outside and cuts his hand open and bleeds this bright green goo that gives birth to demons right up from the ground. And the demons then attempt to invade the boarding house, and Breaker sets about protecting the windows and doors with that liquid inside of his key. Now, neither the demons nor the Collector can get in through the barriers that Breaker makes. And he tells everybody inside that they just need to stay together and stay indoors until the morning. It will all pass in the morning. The only things that protects them are the blood inside the key and anything that can destroy the demon's eyes. And it turns out Breaker is just the latest in a long line of like keepers of this key. It's an ancient artifact that actually goes back to when God created light, and these keys belong to these demons that was kind of ruling in the darkness. And when God created light, it scattered the demons across the universe and their keys. But now the demons have basically, 6 of those 7 keys that they used to have, and the one the Breaker has is the final one that they have not yet possessed. Each keeper of the key fills the key with their own blood, and then they die, passing it on to the next keeper. And Breaker was given the key by his commanding officer in World War I. But throughout the night, the collector tries to convince people inside the boarding house to basically let him in by possessing them. The first target is Cordelia, and he basically kind of smooth talks her and possesses her by calling her beautiful and saying that the word whore is such a negative thing and is such a bad thing, and he would never want to call her that and stuff like that. So he ends up possessing her, and she ends up killing Wally and then cuts off Irene's arm before Breaker can kill her. And against Breaker's orders, the others want to take Irene for help at the hospital. So they use an underground series of tunnels that will take them pretty much into town and far away from the boarding house. Now, while in the tunnels, Jerry Lean finds a boy named Danny, and they are chased back to the boarding house by demons and locals possessed by the collector. And Roach shoots his boss, who happens to be Danny's father, for paying him so low for so long. But that's a huge mistake because it causes the seal that Breaker made for the hole that they used in the wall to get into the tunnel to basically fall and allow more demons to try to get in. And after Breaker explains who he is and what the key was, the others go off to try to find Danny, who slipped away. But Roach covertly steals the key from Breaker with the intent to try to broker a deal with the collector. And the collector attempts to seduce Jerry Lean like he did Cordelia, but she's not as easy to sway. But maybe Uncle Willie can be a little bit easier, as the collector kind of creates a vision of a wild beach party with a bar and a bunch of sexy topless girls. And this kind of turns out to be a little bit of like a play on The Shining when Jack Torrance meets the bartender, and he gets drunk without really having anything to drink. So it's very similar to that. And sure enough, Willie gets possessed by the collector. And while Willie tries to kill Breaker, the collector tries to seduce Irene by promising to give her arm back to her, but she's not going to have that. Now, meanwhile, Roach talks to the collector to make that deal. And of course, the collector is not one who will make deals, and he instantly goes back on his end of the bargain the moment that he got the key and has his demons kill Roach. But the good news is that Breaker is able to get it back fairly quickly, since Uncle Willie is no longer a problem, and Breaker found this bow and some arrows that he can shoot at the collector. Irene takes herself and a bunch of demons out with some grenades that she found with Wally's things, because there was a whole thing about how he planned to blow up the post office that he worked at and so forth. That's kind of how sad that character is. He had real problems. But the only ones left are now Breaker, Danny, and Jerry Lean, but Danny's possessed by the collector, and he mortally wounds Breaker. Breaker's whole reason for coming here is to find a new keeper of the key, and he's chosen Jerry Lean. And after killing Demon Danny, Jerry Lean refills the key with Breaker's blood, and he tells her that she was proven to be the right person to become a keeper because she resisted the collector's offer to join him. He passes the job on to her and tells her that when the stars on her palm align into a circle, that will be time for her to seek out a new keeper, and the battle will continue on beyond her. Once Breaker died, all his seals he set earlier open up again, and it gives the collector and his demons basically free reign of the boarding house. Jerry Lean covers herself in Breaker's blood, and that means that neither the collector nor any of his demons could touch her. But he is able to grab her with a shower curtain and wash the blood off of her, and he attempts to bring her over to his side, but when she doesn't answer, he then just kind of says, all right, to hell with it, I'm just going to kill you and cut your heart out. And that's when she spits blood from inside the key into his face, and his true demon appearance shows himself, and he explodes. The next morning, she gets on a bus with her cat, and she catches a glimpse of a new collector who will give chase to her, and they give each other a knowing look. Our friend the Crypt Keeper shows back up at the end. He says that Jerry Lean lives happily ever after, but he needs to get ready to go to the premiere of his movie. However, as he's walking the red carpet, he figures that there is still one more price to pay for having final cut on his film. And that's when he walks up to a guillotine where his producers cut his head off. And that's the end of the movie. So let's get to the 3 things I like about Demon Knight. First, while I do think there are some appropriate criticism levied against this film looking kind of like a TV show production as opposed to a feature film, I can appreciate this having a little more of a typical Tales from the Crypt look and feel to it. It doesn't feel like something that just has the Tales from the Crypt name slapped onto the poster with an opening and closing scene with the Crypt Keeper to kind of tie it all together. It does seem to have a consistent look, vibe, and quality that the show had. And it's got a great cast of people who would have been sought after for episodes of the series anyway. It wasn't a bad job to get a role on an episode back in the 90s. It's hard to explain, but I guess it kind of boils down to this. The familiar look and feel of the movie does give people who liked watching the TV show something to kind of hold on to and to kind of feel comfortable with. There's so many, times that something is upgraded from TV to film that has little things that make it feel kind of off. I felt that way going to see like Star Trek Generations, where it was the exact same ship as The Next Generation. The movie just came out like 7 months after or 6 months after the show ended. And it just, I don't know, but they made these small changes in lighting and set design that really stood out to me. And I understand how things might need to be designed a little different from a production standpoint for film and TV. Like TV needs brighter lighting and what have you, but it's still jarring. And I think Demon Knight and the follow-up Bordello of Blood both have a look to them that is familiar to fans of the show, and it doesn't make you feel out of place or changed in a way that you might feel kind of weird about it. In addition, the demons do look great in this. If there's one thing that definitely stands out as a true cinematic feature to this movie, it's the demons themselves. They are cool. They are very well designed, and they are actually also kind of creepy. And I love glowy-eyed demons. It's all good stuff. Now, speaking of familiarity, I like the simplistic setting and plot. This is my second like here. Like with Alien or Night of the Living Dead in horror, or a submarine movie in a war film or drama, having a confined space creates tension quickly. Here we have a single building, a former church of all things, that is getting invaded by Billy Zane and his demons. There are only so many rooms to go to. There are only so many ways in and out. There are only so many people you can really trust inside. And speaking of trusting people inside the confined space, the people inside the boarding house are all familiar with each other. They have some internal conflict that will ultimately play out a little later, but that internal conflict creates more conflict when Breaker is introduced as an outsider to this sort of closer-knit group. The kind of thing this kind of thing will always work for me. You bring people together into a confined space with all the monsters outside or around any corner, and then that creates tension on both sides. You got monsters coming in, you got monsters already inside. And that's where you can get, some level-headed people in this movie like Irene, and loose cannons like Roach, and people who have faults like Uncle Willie, and people who will do whatever needs to be done like Jerry Lean. And I always think about something like Night of the Living Dead. The real danger aren't necessarily the monsters outside. It's the jerks who can't agree with anyone on the inside that just makes everything that much more dangerous for survival. Now, thirdly, I talked last week kind of briefly about Stephen Dorff chewing scenery in Blade. Well, this week we have another baddie that is just about chewing every single thing in the scenery, and that is Billy Zane. And to be honest with you, Zane had mostly smaller parts in movies that I'd seen prior to Demon Knight, but starting about here is where he really does seem to get pretty close to being a major movie star. The following year, he becomes The Phantom. And while that movie does have mixed results, he does have the right look, the smile and the proper jawline to be a superhero in a cowl. Of course, he has a major villain role in Titanic, where he's this kind of typical rich prick that likes the girl our main hero likes. Here, though, he is all in as the Collector. He seems to kind of dance in and out of his scenes. He's cocky, he's giving you that Billy Zane smile, and he tries to talk you into doing something bad. He's super compelling. In fact, I would downright call him likable in this movie, even if he might punch through your face and tear your head off. I have no doubt that the collector is supposed to be more likable or appealing of a character than almost anyone else in the movie, even Geraldine, who's our main heroine by the end of it. This is just a pretty darn good example of the exact right actor for the exact right part. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Please don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast on Wednesday mornings and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next week, I'll look at a British monster movie that finds us cowering in fear of it. Until next week, stay spooky.